सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen though.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Climate change, global warming, how to cut emissions have been one of the biggest concerns the world has been dealing for several years now. For the last 10 days, it is front and center of the global concern because of the COP27 summit taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. This is an annual conference which takes place in different parts of the world where everyone in the world, all countries and their leaders and people who are involved with climate action get together and try to find ways to cut emissions and keep global warming to a certain level. This is not as simple as it sounds because it also takes a lot of doing. And one of the biggest things that global experts talk about this year is the need for climate finance. What is climate finance? Why is it so important? And why do we at ThePrint think that climate finance will make or break this COP27 summit in Egypt? That is the theme of our Macro Sutra this week. Hello and welcome. I'm YP Rajesh, Managing Editor at ThePrint, and I have Radhika Pandey from the NIPFP. Hi Radhika. It's a slightly unusual topic for us to be dealing with, but it's part of political economy, macroeconomy, because the climate change, global warming are so intertwined with our lives, our economies, what economies are doing right now to tackle this most serious and urgent problem facing the world. And we are talking about climate finance. Before we go into the nitty-gritties of what is happening there, what is climate finance?
So, just if we look back and look at the kind of countries who have been emitting into the atmosphere, the countries that are the major emitters of greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. Historically, if we see, there are a set of countries who have been the dominant emitters, like United States, like China, because the Industrial Revolution started there. They started using coal extensively, invention of steam engine. The Industrial Revolution began and that led to a surge in the CO2 emissions. Now they have reached a particular level of development, but there are other countries which are now beginning, they are embarking on the path of development, but at the same time they are exposed to the climate risks of which they are not responsible. They are not responsible relatively, they are not as much responsible as the major industrial economies or the major advanced economies. While all countries are responsible for reducing their emission, there is a need felt or responsibility of advanced economies to help smaller countries or developing countries who are vulnerable, who are exposed to the vagaries of the climate change. So the finance which is needed to help countries to either cut their greenhouse gas emissions or to adapt to the climate risk, that finance is called climate finance. So primarily it has two components. One is mitigation and the other is adaptation. Mitigation means mitigating the climate risks. Whatever steps need to be taken to cut the greenhouse gas emission, whatever financing is needed towards investing in more greener sources of energy, investing in renewable sources, those kind of financing are termed as climate mitigation financing.
So for example, setting up a solar plant.
Yes, setting up a solar plant.
The money required to set up a solar plant is climate finance.
Yes. So the investment required for setting up solar plant will be mitigation climate finance. Now in adaptation, some amount of damage has already happened. So we need to make our infrastructure resilient to adjust to that kind of damage. So we know that the levels of sea is rising. So if we set up some infrastructure, if we set up some bridges or dams that will address that rising sea levels or provide a kind of defense against the rising sea level.
Or a simple wall.
Yes, or simple, yes. So that is adaptation. That is that finance which is advanced for those kind of purposes to adapt to the rising mitigating climate risk is adaptation. So these two make up for the climate finance. And in various of these climate conferences, the conversation is happening around what should be the amount that advanced economies should provide to those countries which are more exposed and more vulnerable to these kind of climate risks.
As the readers of ThePrint may have noticed, my colleague Simran Sirur is in Sharm el-Sheikh reporting directly from the ground from COP27. And one of the articles she wrote a couple of days back was on climate finance and the definition of climate finance. Why climate finance is such a technical, controversial issue that, they can't even agree on the definition of climate finance. Can you throw some light on that? Yes. Why is the definition itself so complicated?
Yes. So if we again look at the history of why, because this is a very contentious issue. And so if we go back to 2009, in 2009, in the Copenhagen COP meeting, it was committed, there was a collective commitment by advanced countries that they will provide $100 billion as a collective commitment to developing countries. So that was agreed upon. And then it was formalized in the next COP meeting that was held at Cancun. It was formalized. And from the Paris summit onwards, it was decided that, it would be extended till 2020. That every year, $100 billion of funding should be provided by advanced economies to developing countries. Now, what that led to a lot of controversy, because what was happening was any kind of development aid that was being financed from, say, multilateral development bodies to developing countries, that was also tagged as climate finance. Any kind of loan was also tagged as climate finance. Now, that led to a tension that, if you are just providing loans, that is pushing these countries into a debt burden. They are already suffering and you are pushing them into debt burden. So finance should be on flexible term. It should be either grant based. It should be on concessional sources. So those nitty-gritties need to be defined in the overall umbrella of climate finance. It should not just be that you tag any kind of assistance as climate finance. So that definition is needed, that any kind of development aid which was anyways coming, it's not something new and additional finance, but it is anyway coming, that is also redefined as climate change. So those kind of, and there has been a lot of controversy around this. In fact, in 2015, Ministry of Finance, our Ministry of Finance wrote a note criticizing the way this climate finance flow is being recorded and documented. So OECD is responsible for putting out the data on how much is the climate finance flow happening from advanced countries to developing countries. So while the target is $100 billion, in each of these years till now, we have never achieved that goal. In 2020, it was $83 billion. But even that is controversial because it consists of a lot of loans. It consists of money coming from private sources. It consists of development aid, and all of that it is debatable whether you can say it is all climate finance. So that is why India is pushing that at least in this COP27, we should all agree on what are the contours of a climate finance, what is the precise definition, what are the terms under which it should be advanced, and who is going to give how much. $100 billion is the collective amount. How much is the US going to give? How much is China or other advanced countries, EU is giving? Is there a way to determine that? So that is what the discussion is all about.
Radhika, do we know how these numbers are determined in the first place? I mean, do we know how $100 billion is enough? Now there is this demand for 1.3 trillion annually.
Right.
So how are these numbers, thrown around?
So when this $100 billion was arrived at, there was a lot of criticism and controversy that this is just a number. It is not based on the actual needs of the economy. Okay. So there is a term which is called nationally determined contribution. All countries come up with their internal targets. How much they are going to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. How much is the shift happening from non-renewable to renewable sources of energy. So there are targets which they have to meet, and they have to rework or renew these NDCs, they are called nationally determined contribution. So it is on the basis of these NDCs, they should serve as the basis for determining climate finance. If India sets up very ambitious targets, India does require a steady stream of finance. If our targets are not very ambitious, then we will require less amount of funding. But if we are setting up targets and if we are doing better than the target, then the requirement will be more. And based on that, there are various estimates, like the United Nations Environment Program has come up with estimates only for adaptation. You know, for till 2030, what will be the adaptation finance needed every year, and then after 2030, what is the amount? And you go by any estimate, $100 billion is a gross understatement, and you know the requirement is in trillions of dollars. It's a very small amount, and therefore now in the COP27, they have to, one of the agenda is to come up with a new collective goal for financing, which will be applicable from 2024 onwards.
25 onwards.
Yes.
Yeah. But there is this constant friction, constant tug, which the developing countries want more, developed countries don't want to give.
Yeah.
They never come to an agreement. Like, you know, even the accounting has been an issue. And one of the other pieces my colleague Simran did, which I will also, you know, share the link with the notes of this show, along with the previous one on the definition, is that now, to quote from her article, she says, now observers and negotiators at COP27 have told ThePrint that rich country groups now want developing countries to contribute to climate finance fund and pay for losses and damages arising from climate change, even as they themselves have failed to deliver on their own promises.
Yes.
Now they're trying to push the onus on the developing countries, saying, you also fund it a little bit.
Yeah.
So this is this a refusal to take responsibility, or is this sheer economic difficulties for them to, you know, share funds, contribute funds? What is at the heart of it?
The argument of the developing countries, including India, is that these countries are traditionally or historically, they have been the dominant emitters. So if we look at the past 20 years, yes, India's emission has increased, but as compared to its population,
per
its
capita,
emission, it's low. Whereas if we look at countries like the US, they are contributing more than 25% of the overall emissions. India has come up with a statement, you know, it came up with a statement yesterday on loss and damage financing, which we'll also talk about. There they have listed 7 reasons why, while all countries are exposed to climate change, but it's the developed countries should be helping developing countries. And some of those reasons are that, you know, developing countries are more exposed and are more vulnerable. Their financial markets are less developed. They are technologically backward. So some conditions have been listed. So that is why this friction is there. And now in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, the conditions have turned even more difficult for advanced economies. US, EU, they are in the grip of recession. So how much money they can step aside, given their own domestic political economy problems, how much money they can set aside for climate financing. It is a challenge. It's an open question.
I'll conclude with one last question from your Macro Sutra column, Radhika. You conclude your piece by saying, in parallel, the regulatory framework in developing countries should facilitate the flow of climate finance. This would require harmonizing the taxonomy and the disclosure framework with globally accepted standards. What do you mean by harmonizing the taxonomy and disclosure framework?
Right. So one, we are talking about the flow of finance from advanced economies to developing economies. But at the same time, what the developing economies also need to do, they need to step up their disclosure standards. So there are a lot of these pension funds who are looking for investments in green energy. They are looking for investment in ESG compliant entities, environment, social, government compliant entities. So that requires better disclosures on the part of companies, that, you know, how much they are through, if you provide us investments, how much emissions we are going to cut, what will be the reduction and move towards green energy. So all that requires proper disclosures, and we have these international standards on disclosures. If SEBI comes up with the framework to harmonize companies' disclosure framework with internationally accepted framework, that will further augment the flow of private capital coming from these pooled sources like Canadian pension funds. They have have apparently shown a lot of interest in investing in India, especially in the green energy sector. So all that requires proper disclosure. SEBI has come up with a framework. Some part of it is voluntary, but going forward, it will become mandatory, and then it will promote, augment more sources. The other is the green bonds framework. We know that the government of India has come up with a green bond framework statement. So the point here is that while we do need international public climate finance sources from advanced economies, we also need to improve our framework so that there is a ready source of private capital finance at competitive interest rates.
Let's take questions, Radhika, and the first one is from our most loyal questioner, Aditya. Hello, Aditya. Hope you are well. Last week, there was a comment from someone saying, you should get Aditya to be on the show, considering he asks so many questions. That may actually not be a bad idea. We will think about that one day. Aditya's question, Radhika, is it has been seen that developing nations like India are more serious in implementing the resolutions passed at COP as compared to developed nations, considering the fact that their energy requirements are way more than the developed ones. Do you think there can be some financial benefits like duty exemptions that can be provided to countries which perform well in respect of fulfilling commitments?
So all these commitments are long term. For example, we have in our Panchamrit the COP26 commitments, the commitments that we made in the last COP meeting held at Glasgow. We said that we will be net zero by 2070. So there are some long term commitments and there are some short-term commitments, say by 2030, by 2045. So what is important is that if a country does better on these commitments, there should be incentivized to have more finance. In the COP framework, there are a number of such funds which have been set up, like the Green Energy Fund and other funds. If the ranking or the rating of countries improve on their compliance with their nationally determined commitment, they should be entitled to more share of finance at more flexible terms. This is something that can be done. This is something that can be agreed upon at least by countries. Because on the other, on duty exemption, there is no one-on-one comparison because all countries have charted their own path towards net zero or towards clean energy. So the best way is to give more and more incentives so that they move faster on their goals.
The next question is from Ronak Patel. Are COP countries creating a fund? What are the programs you think this fund will finance? And what is the impact of India's LIFE or LIFE initiative?
In terms of fund, we've spoken about that, the one of the agenda is to now talk about a new collective goal, the new funding, which will begin from 2025. The amount needs to be worked out, and what will be whether it will have sub-constituents for mitigation, adaptation. And the third element of finance, which is being talked about in this COP27, is loss and damage, which many developing countries have been advocating that this should also be one element of finance, because one is mitigation, one is adaptation, which is ex ante, like you are developing your capacity to deal with climate change, climate risks. But what if some amount of damage has already happened? So for that, if some compensation is provided to compensate for the economic and non-economic losses due to climate change, that is categorized as loss and damage funding. And that is also in principle agreed upon as one of the sources of funding in COP27. But now we are towards the end of the conference, but we don't see any concrete step taken on what will be the modality of this fund, whether it will be a separate fund or whether it will be part of the new collective goal that they are talking about. All those things are being worked about, and it takes a lot of time because all countries' interests are different. But yes, what needs to be seen is that now what will be the funding once the $100 billion funding gets over. So from 2025, what is their decision?
Hitesh Nautiyal asks, don't you think as far as environment is concerned, the developed countries expect all the steps to save the environment should be taken by developing countries? And what are the steps that India must take to ensure that it is energy sustainable? I think I'll answer the first part. No, Hitesh, developed countries don't expect all the steps to be taken by the developing countries. There is something called common but differentiated goals. All of us, all countries in the world should take certain steps, but the polluter must pay more. So whichever the country has polluted more, and we know we have a list, the US, Europe, China, in that order of ranking.
Right.
So they have to do more. The countries that have polluted more have to do more, and the countries that have polluted less will have to do less. But everybody has to do something.
Correct, yes.
That is the general agreement. What are the steps India must take to ensure that it is energy sustainable?
So India has been taking steps, and those steps are being recognized and lauded. In COP26, they came up with these 5 targets for reducing emission intensity of GDP, and we did better than what we had proposed in 2015. So how much emission intensity of GDP will be reduced by 2030? Earlier it was targeted at 30 or 35%. Now we said that by 2030 we will reduce it by 50% over the 2005 level. So we are doing better on the our nationally determined contribution. And in COP27, the minister has come up with this long-term strategy for low emission development, which includes things like electricity-based transport, more resilient urban infrastructure, move towards afforestation. A lot of steps are being taken, given that we are also emitting, but not at the same level as other countries and relative to our population. But in terms of setting up targets, we are at least moving in that direction, and we are doing better than our nationally determined contributions.
Last question again from Aditya. What can be the financial implications the world can face if it doesn't work towards managing climate change?
If we don't manage climate change, there will be these climate disasters. We are already seeing Pakistan floods. We saw sea level rising. We are seeing extreme cold in Europe. So all these are all implications of climate change. And therefore, in Paris Agreement, it was decided that the countries would try to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees as compared to the pre-industrial levels. We are nowhere near that, but at least unless commitments are repeated, unless there's a recognition of the fact that more needs to be done, we will not move forward. And so there will be more disasters, and then more money has to be allocated towards reconstruction, more money has to be allocated towards recovery and reconstruction. Investment will suffer. So the entire economy will be in for a collapse if we don't move towards decarbonization and reducing carbon footprint, but at the same time move through what is termed as just transition. So that is something which many countries are talking about, and South Africa is taking the lead on this, and countries like US, EU are assisting South Africa in moving towards a just transition, that is moving towards from coal and other sources to more cleaner sources of energy without harming employment and other economic factors. So we have to be cognizant, we have to move towards decarbonization and reducing carbon footprint to save the economy.
I mean, just one example comes to mind, Radhika. Unseasonal heavy rains, which we are seeing in many parts of India, forget the rest of the world. And what happened in Bangalore just recently, where a part of the city was submerged and people had to take boats. It is India's IT capital. And the disruption it caused to economic activity, to lives, has a cost, has an economic cost. So that is what climate change can do. It could be rains in Bangalore, extreme heat in some other part of the country, snow in somewhere else, melting glaciers. So climate change is not just about our quality of life. It hurts the economy big time. And that is the reason we picked up that topic today, climate finance for Macro Sutra. Hope you enjoyed and liked the insights we brought. Thank you so much for watching. We will be back next week with another episode. Until then, stay safe and care for the climate.